You know, we've been making a platformer, but really we haven't been doing any such thing because we've just been going over the basics of how to set up the first steps to make your game in Unreal. So let's actually start making something more like a platformer, because we can't even jump right now. And jumping is fairly straightforward to implement within Unreal, because if you're using a character blueprint, it's just built in as a function. Compared to the last 3 videos, which all went very long, this should be fairly compact. So what we'll do is we'll find the location for all of our assets here, and we'll make a new input action. We've gone over all this before in previous videos, so I finally can start speeding up and assuming that we're on the same page about things. So let's make an input action for jump, and we'll call this jump player, just so that I can recognize it. Jump, the value type will actually be bool, because we're either jumping or we're not jumping. There's no axis to this. There's no, we're 30% jumping. We're just jumping or we've stopped jumping. Those are the only 2 things that we can do. So this is going to be super easy to implement as well because of that. Open up our input mappings, add a new mapping, look for our jump player, and we're going to be jumping with spacebar, of course, and then also the bottom face button on our controller. And that's everything there is to that. It's really as easy as that. So now back in our player character, let's make a little bit of room for our event graph. We drag in our player jump, just as you expect. We have triggered, started, ongoing, cancelled, completed. However, what we're going to be doing here is we're actually going to not be using triggered, unlike the first input actions that we did in the input video. What we're going to do is whenever we start, we want to just jump, and whenever we complete, we want to stop jumping. And you might think, is it as easy as that? And I'm going to say, it's kind of as easy as that, yeah. If you want to be 100% sure, you can also hook in cancel to this if you want to. Generally doesn't really do anything. And just with that, we have a jump. So it's a bit of a shit jump, because we don't have the animation set up for it yet and stuff, and we don't jump particularly high either. So we're going to need to fine-tune and tweak that to be the way that we want it to be, but that's basically the whole idea to jumping. So jump and stop jumping are just pre-existing functions on the character blueprints that just launch you into the air and stop launching you into the air. If we go into the character movement component here, and we look at the jump Z velocity, and we set that to something a little bit higher, set it to something, I don't know, 750 instead, you will see that we jump a bit higher, which for most platformers is more along the lines of what you want to do. So you can see we can jump around a little bit. It's a little floaty because the gravity is just like normal Earth gravity. And between you and me, normal Earth gravity is actually kind of lenient for most platforming games. Because most platformers, believe it or not, have heavier gravity than normal Earth. Because that makes it feel weighty and snappy and good in all sorts of ways. So while this is a good start, it doesn't make for a good feeling game. Also, I hooked up cancelled here because might as well, it doesn't do that much. Because stop jumping doesn't maybe quite do what you think it would do, because what it does is it stops applying new force in the upward direction, but it doesn't actively cancel out any upward direction force. So what you end up with is, even with a small tap, you still jump pretty damn high. So first and foremost, what we want to do is when we stop jumping, I also want to cancel out pretty much any vertical movement that we have at all. That makes it a lot more snappy immediately. And the way you can do that is just by getting your character movement and set the velocity if you'd like to. But there's actually a function that just kind of does that for you, which is called launch character. And if we set launch character to just Z override, and we set this to 0, 0, 0, what this will do by default is if overriding is false, it just adds whatever velocity we put into this to the current velocity of our character. If we set it to overriding, it's, non-surprisingly, overrides it instead. So if we add 0, 0, 0, XY, we just add it, so it doesn't do anything. Adding 0 to anything obviously just remains the same. But the Z, we override. Well, that's going to make it immediately stop its movement in the Z direction. One minor issue is that it doesn't actually override with a value of 0, so you need to give it a value of 1, or even just -1 to immediately make it go down. It's effectively still a value of 0, but it just doesn't really like when you use a value of 0. Downside being, if you do this while already going downward, it kind of stalls your movement for a bit. So what you actually want to do is we want to split this structure up in, and we want to get the value that is the lowest, either -1 or whatever the current downward velocity for our character movement already is. So we can get our character movement components, we can get the velocity, just like we did before. If we split this structure up in as well, there is a built-in functionality for this as well. If we take the min float, it's going to take the lowest value between the two inputs here. So -1 and then the z velocity. If our z velocity is positive, it's going to pick -1. If our z velocity is under -1, that is a lower value than -1. So it's going to be picking that. That way, it's not going to make that little like stutter if you let go of it during your downward spiral, as you can see right there. So this immediately makes our input feel a bunch snappier, which is kind of good. Still, the jump itself is fairly floaty, so we can tweak that as well. If we go into the character movement components, we just have a gravity scale. And that gravity scale we can set to something like 2.5. Now, that means that our initial jump is also going to be less high, but you can see how much more snappy this like immediately feels, right? Maybe 2.5 is a bit much, admittedly. So this is where your own personal preference comes in. 175, maybe, could be kind of nice. And that feels pretty good. However, I'm going to do something a little bit more fun. And that is, I want to change this gravity scale dynamically as we jump. So as we start jumping, the gravity scale will be very low. It's just going to be like a value of 1, maybe 1.5, something like that. And then the longer that jump goes on, it's going to start increasing that gravity, meaning that we have a pretty strong upward jump. And then we're going to increasingly get pulled down to the ground faster until we get our peak gravity. That way we can make a interesting gravity curve. So for this, we finally really need to upgrade the way that we've been doing this blueprint stuff so far. Because we've gotten to the third video, last video, without making a single variable. And to my surprise, this is the fourth video, we haven't made a single custom event yet. So let's make a custom event. You can just right click and make a custom event. This is then a bit of code that you can give a name. So let's call this player jump. And we can call this event at any point at any time now from this character. So we can just do player jump here instead. And instead of just directly doing the jump in here, what we do is we can put the jump in there alongside other code. So we get a singular node here that we can just call onPlayerJump. It's easy, it's compact, and then all the actual implementation for what jumping means can exist like down here, a little bit more organized. So how do we do all that? Well, what we're going to be doing is we add a timeline. And not the timeline component, we just want to add a timeline. That adds this yellow node, which we'll call gravity scaling or something like that. And here we can choose any of these inputs. We can play it from its current position, can play it from the start always, we can make it stop, we can make it reverse, and that does reversing from its current play position. We can reverse it from the end position back to the start, or we can set a new play position time where it takes in this new time. What we're going to be doing is we're going to be using this to play from the start. And this will, every frame, run whatever we put into this update pin. And then once it's reached the end of the entire timeline, it will one single time run what we put into this finished. So let's also do a sequence here, like we did the last time. And we're going to make it start the gravity scale timeline, which we'll get back to in a moment. And then it's going to be jumping. It doesn't really matter. We can just put the jump in between here if we really wanted to, like this. This would work effectively the same way, but I just like keeping things organized in Blueprint as much as possible. So this, if we double click on it, has an interface. So we can add a track, a flow track in this case. And what we're going to do is we're going to animate over time the strength of our gravity. So we can add in a key, and at the time 0, that's the start of our timeline, the value for our gravity is going to be somewhat lower. So let's say 1.25. Then, over the course of, let's say, 2 seconds, I want that gravity to gradually increase. We can just set this to 2 seconds. To a value of the 2.5 we had before. It was a little heavy, but if we start with a slightly lower gravity, our initial jump will be higher and everything should kind of feel a little bit better there. Then if we really want this to not be as linear as it is right now, because right now what it's doing is it's just a linear line between point A and point B. We can right click on these things and we can say that we want these to be automatically like cubic interpolation, which means that it's going to have a little bit of easing at the beginning and a little bit of easing at the end. Might feel a little bit smoother. You can change these handles a bit to increase or decrease just how steep that easing is. And like this, it still is almost linear. It's just got a little bit smoother in and out points. It's kind of nice. Then we can set the length of this thing to whatever we want it to be. So ideally, that would just be the 2 seconds that we're taking here. What you could also do is you could just say, hey, the last keyframe is just going to be the end of this timeline. Ignore how long it actually is. That tends to be the way that I use these. You can give the track a name as well. Just rename it to Gravity. And if you have a lot of things going on in one of these timelines, you actually can add as many different tracks to a single timeline node as you really need it to. If I want to add a color track, which is going to give me values for red, green, and blue, and maybe even alpha, also alpha, it seems. It's also going to be outputting that now. So we have an output for our gravity and our new track 1, which is a color. I don't care about the color like in actuality though, so I'm going to be deleting that. We only care about the gravity. We got our character movement. We set the gravity scale just to whatever this gravity value is in our update. Now this needs a little bit more tweaking, but I'm going to just show you initially what this does. As you can see, we go up fairly smoothly, but then at some point the gravity catches up to us and we start going down a lot faster. So this just makes jumps feel a lot more like satisfying and a lot more snappy. I actually think that we maybe could stand to even increase this gravity a little bit more. So I want to change this around a little bit to be a bit more adjustable and a bit more data-driven in a certain way. So what we will do instead is we'll take this at a time of 0 and we'll give this a value of 0. And you think, oh, that's going to get rid of the gravity entirely? Don't worry, it'll make sense in a moment, hopefully. And then at the end time, I'm just going to give this a value of 1. What this is going to do is it's going to allow us to use the value that this outputs to interpolate between arbitrary values. So right now, instead of this being the gravity, what we'll call this instead is we'll call this gravity alpha. And all this is going to do is it's going to represent a percentage, a 0 to 1 value of where we want to be between a minimum gravity and a maximum gravity. And the way that we can calculate where actually we are on that spectrum is just by using a lerp. A float lerp. Lerp stands for linear interpolate. What that does is it takes an A value and a B value, in this case a minimum and a maximum, and it calculates if your alpha is 0, it takes A, if your alpha is 1, it takes B. So this is the way we're going to be driving the gravity scale. Because now we can just make these two things variables. So we can say promote this to a variable, min gravity, and promote this to a variable, max gravity. And now we can much more easily just set these two values. And if we now need to use them at any other point, which we're going to need to in a moment, we'll be able to. So the minimum gravity I actually kind of liked at 1.25. And then let's set the max gravity to 3 instead, something even a little bit higher. And you'll see this still works exactly the same. It's a little heavier because, of course, we've got this max gravity thing higher now. Now, there's potentially one little issue, and this comes down to your own design insights, to be honest with you. But if I let go of my jump button, that timeline still interpolates. Maybe what you want to do, I actually think that the way that it works is fine, but maybe what you want to do is when you let go of your jump button, when you stop jumping, you just instantly want your gravity scale to jump to its max. This is, again, very much a design-based decision. This is whatever you want it to do. But if you just copy this stuff over, the character movement, set gravity scale, just immediately set it to our max scale variable, then you will feel that when I let go, it is just a little bit more snappy in actually letting me go down immediately, which adds in a bit of a gameplay twist to actually holding down your button mattering a little bit more. It gives you a little bit more control over exactly how you jump around. I have to cut in here a little bit during the editing process of this video to let you know that you need to do a little bit more to make this work. Because what this will do is it will make you stop jumping and it will set the gravity to your maximum amount, but that timeline that we set up still will be running. So it's immediately also going to override the gravity back to whatever it says the gravity should be. So you should be making a custom event that will first stop the timeline by going into the timeline's stop input, and then set the gravity to our new max gravity. Now, speaking of control, you will notice that we don't have that much mid-air control. I mean, we have some, but we effectively just cannot move side to side while in mid-air. And that comes down to some of these character movement component settings. So if we go into the falling settings, we have the braking deceleration when falling. This could be used as a different way of accomplishing this launch character setup that we have here. I just prefer kind of hard coding that stuff with this node. But this is the value that you're more or less meant to use for that. I personally don't. But we've got an air control thing here, which is only 5%. So we've got about 5% of the control that we have on the ground while we're in air. For a platformer, it's a little bit on the low side, isn't it? If we just set this to 1, we effectively have full control of our character while in midair, which is good for platforming purposes. As you can see, I can just like move around and immediately makes everything feel a bit more snappy, but still our acceleration in midair, it feels a little floaty, it feels a little weird. And that is because the velocity that we already had still maintains the path that we had, because we don't have any deceleration. While we're walking, we have friction from the ground, right? We have this ground friction value, which stops us from sliding all over the place. If we want to have ice physics, that is what we would set to a low value or even 0. We don't have that friction by default in the air. That is what this falling lateral friction does. If we set that to a fairly high number, let's set it to something like 100, you'll notice that it feels a lot more controllable while we're in midair. For a lot of these things, by the way, if you want to really feel what they do, don't just tweak them little by little, one by one. What you probably want to do is you want to crank one of these values super high up, so you specifically feel what that one value does. Because then you start to learn, okay, that is what this value controls, and then when you pull it back, you can actually start tuning this with intention rather than just kind of randomly pulling levers and hoping that it ends up doing what you want it to do. But if we put this at a friction of 100, you can see this is so much tighter to control now. It's actually like kind of great already, honestly. So we pretty much have a still somewhat floaty, but pretty good setup for a platformer. And the floatiness comes down to a combination of our Z jump velocity initially and our minimum gravity. So if we set this to being 500, or we set this to being like 1.5 by default, kind of accomplishes the same thing. The difference being is quite small, but if you change the minimum gravity, the difference between the interpolation is a little bit smoother, a little bit less of a difference. So it kind of changes the gravity curve a little bit more. But just setting our jumping to 500, this is very, very... it's kind of pathetic jumping for a platforming game. So I think 750 might be pretty good. And this is where you just kind of spend the entirety of your life tweaking this stuff until you die. So let's keep this at maybe just 700 instead. And another thing that you can do to kind of influence this is making this timeline a little bit shorter so that it reaches the maximum amount of gravity a little bit quicker. So we still have that initial boost a bit more, but we get pulled down a lot quicker, a lot more. And I actually think that this is a pretty decent feel for the platforming that we're doing. So it's a little aggressive still, so let's set the time to like 1.35. That seems pretty good. Again, tweak this to your heart's content. However you want this to feel is probably good. A lot of how this is going to feel also will come down to your animations and matching these values to actually feel proper with the animations that you're going to be making, and then fine-tuning the animations based on how the actual physics feel. It's a bit of a feedback loop that has to have a couple of revisions to really like nail it. We can get pretty close with just messing around with the default Unreal mannequin as well. And then for the double jumps, it is pretty much as easy as just going into your character. So not the character movement in this case. It's a little weird why that's not on the movement component, but it's on the upmost thing that you can select here, the character class itself. And you can just do max jumps. And the max jump count is 1 by default. We can just set that to 2. And we got a double jump. Just as that. There's nothing more to it. So as one final little thing, let's implement the jump into our animation blueprint as well, because we have jumping animations just given by the template here. So if we just look for jump, we can add in a state here for jumping, and from locomotion we can go into jumping, and technically we can go from falling into jumping as well, because that's what a double jump would allow us to do. So we can set this up like this, and then jump always will go into falling. So we've got a couple of things to work out here. Number one, locomotion into jumping. The condition for this would be if we're falling and Boolean. So this is going to check two conditions. Number one is going to be our variable, and number two is going to be our velocity in the up direction. So we can pull that in, split the structure pin, and check if this velocity is greater than some number. You can just check greater than 0 if you want to. Greater than 100 is a pretty safe bet that you're actually jumping and not just getting like nudged up or something like that. And to give a slight explanation as to what this AND Boolean node does, is it takes in a number of Boolean inputs, so a number of individual true or false values, and has one single output. This single output is only going to output true if all the individual inputs together are true on their own as well. The moment one singular one of its inputs is false, that means it doesn't have everything being true, so it's not true and true and true and true, so it will output false. There's also an opposite version of this, which is a OR Boolean node, which has a number of inputs, and if any of them are true at all, it will output true. So that one will always only output false if every single one of its inputs are false. There's a handful more of these logic comparison version nodes that we're naturally going to run into sooner or later as well. So that will make us go into the jump animation. You pretty much can take this and also put it into the falling to jumping transition as well, because that is the easiest way to set this up. You can do a little bit more code to actually register when something specifically is triggering a double jump, and then make this transition based on a variable that gets set to, hey, I'm doing a double jump. It's not really what we're going to be looking at right here, right now. I want to keep things as simple as possible. So in 99% of cases, this is going to do the exact same thing with a little bit less work. So then all we need to do is we need to figure out, okay, so when we jump, when do we transition into just a normal falling loop state? And if we just click on this transition instead of double clicking, what we can do is we can use an automatic rule based on something. Let me read the rest of that. Sequence player in state. And pretty much what this does is just when the state, the animation in the state is done playing, it just transitions to the next state that it's hooked up to. That's really all that we need to worry about. So now we've got a state machine that goes from walking and running to jumping to falling to walking and running, but also from falling to jumping, back to falling, back to walking and running. So if we just put in the jump animation, this one doesn't need to loop. Matter of fact, it shouldn't loop. Now we have our jumping animation, which just makes it feel a bit more alive, right? Immediately, the physics also feel more reasonable with the jumping. So this is what I'm kind of getting at. It is good to just mess around with effectively like placeholders and gray boxes for your physics. But the moment you start introducing your animations, those need to match the physics. And you might need to adjust the physics a bit to match what animations look good, and so on and so forth. Because just immediately this makes it feel good. I'm pretty lucky with the way that I think the numbers worked out here, between the way that the animation looks and the way that like the gravity scaling and all that kind of stuff works. And I'm actually pretty happy with the way that this has turned out. So a pretty important part of a platformer is done. We have a jump and we even have a double jump. But as you can see, it doesn't quite play the jumping animation properly again, because it doesn't quite get above that amount of velocity that it needs. So what you might want to do is you might want this one to lower to something like checking if it's greater than 10. Just make that threshold a little lower. And if that still doesn't work, like it doesn't for me, another thing that you may be able to do is just make a separate double jump state and make you go from falling into that double jump state. So we'll just take this. Normal jump won't be accessible from falling. We'll just make falling to double jump a thing. And the reason for that is that means that it's not actually using the same sequence player, because what might also be happening is this transition hasn't technically finished yet. So when it goes back in, it doesn't restart the animation. Whereas if it goes into an entirely separate state, it just plays a new sequence player that just happens to be playing the same animation. So that's kind of the way we do this. So again, this one also is just automatic based on the sequence ending, and that might also help you out. So that will, as you can see, make the double jump work a little bit better. Of course, the double jump ideally should probably have its own animation anyway, because it looks a little goofy, a little weird the way it's just jumping off of the air right now. So when we make our own animations, probably make a double jump animation too. And to finish off here, what we'll do is there's one little issue still, and that is if we haven't jumped yet and we walk off of this, you see we fall at a certain speed, at a certain pace with our default gravity. If we have jumped once, our gravity has been influenced now by our timeline, and you'll notice that we fall down a little bit faster. So ideally, what you want to probably do to keep this as simple as possible is just having your max gravity also be whatever your default is. So when you're not jumping, that's also the gravity scale that we're going to be using. So as easy as that, just get your character movements, set the gravity scale to the max gravity variable that we made, and we just do that on begin play. As you recall, begin play just happens whenever the game starts, and this just sets our gravity to being our max gravity instantly. You can kind of mess about with having a different default gravity that can automatically reset whenever you land. And we might mess around with that a little in the future, but this is by far the simpler version of doing it. So you can see our increased gravity just exists right from the start here. And that's pretty much the basics of how we're going to set up a platformer. The platformer is nothing if we don't have anything to collect. So while we've been working on this one blueprint, and hopefully you're slowly becoming more and more comfortable setting up things in Blueprint and kind of like scripting things out now, next time we're going to start making an entirely new blueprint actor, which is going to be like a coin or a gem or something like that that we can collect. And that's going to come with a handful of different things that we need to set up, which are all going to be good learning opportunities. And a very big thank you to all my Patreons. You can see them on screen right now. If you want to help support the channel or get any of the project files in any of my tutorials, there's a link down below to the Patreon page to support me, or alternatively as a YouTube member. My Cave Students tier supporters, Oiku, Earl, Monserville Erno, and my Cave Digger tier supporters, Mauricio Farias.